My chest hurts when I breathe. Hell's Angel. Found a little girl dying on a snowy bench. What happened next will make you cry. The ancient pickup truck groaned as Vince guided it through the thickening snow. His massive hands, covered in faded tattoos, gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles white. The heater wheezed and sputtered, barely keeping the winter chill at bay. Vince's beard, streaked with gray, caught the dim glow of the dashboard lights. His weathered face showed the marks of a hard life. Deep lines around his eyes, a scar above his right eyebrow, and a permanent furrow between his brows. The radio played an old country song, barely audible above the rumble of the engine and the howling wind outside. "Damn weather," he muttered, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. The wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy snowfall, creating brief windows of visibility before the white flakes took over again. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now, back to the story. The grocery bags on the passenger seat rustled with each bump in the road. Just the basics, enough to keep him going for another week in his isolated cabin. Vince preferred it that way. After decades with the Angels, prison time, and too many bridges burned, solitude had become his only comfort. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness like dull knives, illuminating the snow-laden pine trees that lined the narrow road. Every few minutes, Vince had to slow down even more as gusts of wind threw sheets of snow across his path. His mind wandered to the warmth of his cabin, the wood stove that would be nothing but embers by now. The thought of throwing another log on the fire and settling into his worn leather armchair with a book was the only thing keeping him focused on the treacherous drive. The truck's radio crackled, the country music fading into static. Vince reached over and turned it off, leaving him alone with the engine's rumble and his thoughts. The silence felt heavy, pressing in on him from all sides, like the darkness beyond his headlights. He passed the old Miller farm, abandoned years ago, its broken windows staring out like empty eyes. The road curved sharply here, following the contour of the hill. Vince downshifted, the truck's engine protesting as he navigated the turn. That's when his headlights swept across something that didn't belong. A small, dark shape on a bench near the road. At first, he thought it might be a garbage bag someone had left out, or maybe some fallen branches. But as he drew closer, the shape became clearer through the curtain of snow. Vince's heart suddenly kicked against his ribs. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as recognition hit him like a physical blow. There, huddled on the old bus stop bench, was a small figure, a child. He hit the brakes harder than he meant to, the truck's tires fighting for grip on the snow-covered road. The vehicle slid slightly before coming to a stop, its headlights now fully illuminating the bench and its occupant. It was a little girl, curled up into a tight ball. Snow had collected on her like a blanket, suggesting she'd been there for some time. She wasn't moving. Vince's throat went dry. His chest felt tight, and his hands, which had been steady through countless dangerous situations over the years, began to tremble. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the engine's idle seeming unnaturally loud in the winter silence. For a moment, he sat frozen, staring at the small figure through the swirling snow. Then, without conscious thought, his hand moved to the door handle. The truck door creaked open, letting in a blast of frigid air that made Vince wince. Snow crunched under his heavy boots as he stepped out into the storm. The wind whipped at his flannel shirt, making him wish he hadn't left his thick winter jacket in the truck. But there wasn't time to go back for it. Not with that small, still form just a few yards away. Each step toward the bench felt like walking through molasses. His heart hammered against his ribs as he drew closer, afraid of what he might find. The street light above the bench flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow through the falling snow. "Hey!" he called out, his gruff voice barely carrying through the wind. "Kid, can you hear me?" No response. When he reached the bench, Vince's hands that had been in countless fights, worked on countless motorcycles, moved with unexpected gentleness. He brushed away the snow that had accumulated on the child's face, revealing pale skin that felt like ice beneath his calloused fingers. Her dark hair was dusted with white, her small features pinched with cold. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. "Jesus," he muttered, noting her blue-tinged lips and the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Each breath seemed to be a struggle, coming in short, raspy gasps. Without hesitation, Vince shrugged out of his thick winter jacket, the one he'd just retrieved from his truck. The leather was still warm from his body heat as he carefully wrapped it around her tiny frame. She was so small that the jacket engulfed her completely, making her look even more vulnerable. "Stay with me, kid," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He could feel his own body starting to shake, though whether from the cold or fear, he wasn't sure. This close, he could see dark circles under her eyes and hollow cheeks that spoke of more than just tonight's ordeal. Vince fumbled for his cell phone, his trembling fingers making it hard to grip. The screen glowed bright in the darkness as he dialed 911, leaving smudges of melted snow on the display. 911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice came through, clear and professional. I found a little girl," Vince stammered, surprising himself with the crack in his voice. He cleared his throat and continued. "She's unconscious, freezing cold, on the old Miller Road by the abandoned bus stop. Please, she needs help, fast." The dispatcher asked him more questions about the girl's breathing, her pulse, her approximate age. Vince answered as best he could, his eyes never leaving the child's face. He held the phone with one hand while the other kept checking her pulse, terrified it might stop under his fingers. "Help's coming," he told her softly, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "Just hang in there, little one. You're gonna be okay." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying an emotion he hadn't felt in years, fear for someone else. In the distance, sirens began to wail, their sound carrying through the snow-filled air. The noise grew steadily louder, piercing the winter night with its urgent cry. Vince had never been so relieved to hear that sound in his life. "You hear that?" he murmured to the unconscious child. "You're gonna be okay, little one. Hang in there." He kept his hand on her wrist, counting each faint pulse beat like a prayer as the sirens drew closer. Red and blue lights cut through the falling snow, painting the white landscape in alternating colors. 2 paramedics jumped out of the ambulance, their movements quick and practiced as they grabbed their equipment. Their boots crunched against the fresh snow as they rushed toward Vince and the little girl. "Sir, we'll take it from here," the first paramedic said, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands. Her partner, a younger man, was already setting up a portable oxygen tank. Vince's arms tightened instinctively around the small bundle wrapped in his jacket. For a moment, he couldn't make himself let go. The girl seemed so fragile, so defenseless against the world. "Sir?" the paramedic repeated gently. "Right, sorry," Vince mumbled, carefully transferring the child onto their stretcher. His jacket stayed wrapped around her. He couldn't bring himself to take it back. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her vitals and placing an oxygen mask over her tiny face. "How long has she been out here?" the male paramedic asked, while attaching monitoring equipment. "Don't know," Vince answered, his voice rough. "Just found her like this. He ran a hand through his beard, now wet with melting snow. The sight of the girl, dwarfed by medical equipment, made his chest tight. "Good thing you did find her," the female paramedic said, securing the stretcher straps. "Much longer out here." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They wheeled her toward the ambulance, and Vince stood rooted to the spot, watching them load her in. The female paramedic turned back to him. "Are you family?" "No, just found her. Would you like to follow us to the hospital? The police will need a statement." Vince nodded, already heading back to his truck. The drive to the hospital felt both too long and too short. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to make his knuckles white, his mind replaying the image of the girl's blue-tinged lips and shallow breathing. The emergency room was bright and sterile, a sharp contrast to the dark, snowy night outside. Vince's heavy boots squeaked against the polished floor as he paced back and forth in the waiting area. His imposing figure drew nervous glances from other patients, but he barely noticed them. After what felt like hours, a doctor approached him. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Mr. Calhoun?" she asked, consulting her clipboard. "You brought in the young girl?" "Yeah," Vince said, stopping his pacing. "How is she?" "She's stable now, but her condition is serious. She has severe asthma complicated by pneumonia. It appears she's been sick for several days without treatment." The doctor paused, her expression growing more concerned. "We've been trying to locate her family, but there's something you should know." Vince's stomach clenched. "What is it?" "She had a medical ID bracelet on her wrist. Her name is Abigail, and she's 6 years old. But when we tried contacting the listed emergency numbers, none were in service. We've checked with local authorities and—" The doctor sighed. "There's no record of any family members who can claim her." The news hit Vince like a physical blow. He sank into one of the waiting room chairs, his large frame making it creak in protest. The thought of that little girl, Abigail, alone in the world, sick and abandoned, made something deep inside him ache. "No one?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not anyone?" The doctor shook her head sadly. "No one." The rhythmic beeping of medical equipment filled the small hospital room. Vince sat in a chair that seemed too small for his large frame, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched Abigail sleep. The oxygen mask covered most of her tiny face, but her chest now rose and fell in a steady rhythm, unlike the shallow, desperate breaths from earlier. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines, making her appear even smaller and more vulnerable than she had on that snow-covered bench. Her dark hair was spread across the white hospital pillow, and some color had finally returned to her cheeks. The doctors had cleaned her up, replaced her wet clothes with a hospital gown decorated with cartoon animals. Vince's leather jacket hung on the back of his chair, still damp from the snow. His own clothes weren't much better, but he couldn't bring himself to leave, not even to change. Every time Abigail stirred or made the smallest sound, his eyes snapped to her face, checking if she needed anything. A small whimper escaped her lips, and Vince leaned forward, his calloused hand hovering uncertainly over hers. After a moment's hesitation, he gently took her tiny hand in his. Her fingers were so small, they barely wrapped around his thumb. "You're safe now, little one," he whispered, his gruff voice softened with concern. "Nobody's gonna hurt you anymore." The contrast between them couldn't have been starker. His massive, tattooed hand engulfing her delicate one, his weathered face with its thick beard next to her innocent features. Yet something about it felt right, felt natural in a way Vince couldn't explain. The sound of footsteps made him look up. A nurse entered the room carrying a clipboard. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and smile lines around her mouth. She checked Abigail's vitals, noting them down with practiced efficiency. "Her breathing's much better now," the nurse said softly, adjusting the oxygen flow. "The antibiotics are working." She glanced at Vince, studying his face. "You've been here for hours. Most people who find stranded children don't stay this long." Vince shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but didn't let go of Abigail's hand. "Couldn't just leave her alone," he muttered. The nurse nodded, as if confirming something to herself. She pulled up another chair and sat down across from him. "Mr. Calhoun, I need to discuss something with you." She kept her voice low to avoid disturbing Abigail. "We've contacted social services, but they're overwhelmed right now. All the emergency foster homes are full, and the nearest group home is 3 counties away." Vince's grip on Abigail's hand tightened slightly. The nurse noticed and continued. "We can't keep her here much longer. Once she's stable enough to be discharged, she needs somewhere to go." She paused, watching his reaction carefully. "Would you consider taking temporary custody of her? Just until we can find a more permanent solution?" The question hit Vince like a physical blow. Him? Take care of a child? His mind raced with all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. His past, his lifestyle, his complete lack of experience with kids. But when he looked at Abigail's peaceful face, something inside him shifted. He started, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know the first thing about taking care of a kid." "You've already shown more care for her than most," the nurse said gently. "Sometimes that's all that matters." Vince took a deep breath, looking at the small hand in his. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I'll do it." The old truck's headlights cut through the darkness as Vince turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to his cabin. Abigail sat quietly in the passenger seat, bundled in blankets the hospital had given them. Her small frame was dwarfed by the truck's bench seat, and she clutched a stuffed bear, a parting gift from one of the nurses. The cabin emerged from the shadows, a weathered structure of wood and stone that had been Vince's sanctuary for the past few years. It wasn't much, but it was home. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow across the fresh snow, and smoke curled from the chimney thanks to the timer he'd set on the wood stove before leaving. Vince parked and turned off the engine. Sudden silence pressed in around them, broken only by Abigail's soft breathing. He glanced at her, noting how pale and tired she still looked. "We're here," he said, trying to make his deep voice gentler. "Let me carry you inside, okay?" Abigail nodded, her eyes huge in her small face. Vince climbed out and walked around to her side, opening the door carefully. She didn't resist when he lifted her, blankets and all. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, and he found himself holding her a bit tighter, protective. The cabin's door creaked as he shouldered it open. The interior was sparse but clean. A main room with a kitchen area, a worn leather couch, and a stone fireplace. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Everything seemed different now, viewed through the lens of bringing a child into this space. "It ain't much," Vince said gruffly, suddenly aware of how bare and unwelcoming it might seem to a little girl. "But it's warm and dry." The wood stove had done its job. The cabin was comfortably warm. Vince carried Abigail down the hall to the spare room he used for storage. He'd cleared it out earlier, with help from a neighbor, making space for the few things they'd bought on their way from the hospital. A small bed, some clothes, basic necessities. He set her down gently on the bed, which was made up with new sheets covered in colorful butterflies. Abigail looked around the room, her eyes taking in the bare walls and simple furniture. She seemed so small, so lost in this unfamiliar place. "You must be tired," Vince said, helping her take off her shoes. She nodded, her movements slow and drowsy from the medication the doctors had given her. He helped her lie down and tucked the blankets around her, making sure she was warm enough. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first thing she'd said since leaving the hospital. Vince's throat tightened. "You're welcome, little one. Try to get some sleep now." He sat in the chair beside her bed, watching as her eyes grew heavy and finally closed. The room fell into silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the wood stove and the whisper of wind outside. After a while, Abigail stirred in her sleep. Her face scrunched up, and she made a small, distressed sound. "Mama?" she called out softly, her voice breaking even in sleep. "Mama, please." The words hit Vince like a physical blow. He leaned forward, his large hands awkwardly adjusting the blankets around her shoulders. His weathered face, usually set in hard lines, softened as he watched her. The weight of her loss, of her complete aloneness in the world, settled heavy in his chest. He reached out hesitantly and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch gentle despite his calloused fingers. The early morning light crept through the cabin's frost-covered windows. Vince had barely slept, spending most of the night checking on Abigail. The temperature had dropped significantly, and now his breath came out in visible puffs as he moved through the living room. He knelt by the wood stove, his joints creaking in protest. The metal door squeaked as he pulled it open and carefully arranged kindling and smaller logs inside. His large hands, covered in faded tattoos, worked with surprising gentleness as he struck a match and held it to the dry bark. The flame caught quickly, and soon the wood began to crackle. A soft sound from down the hall made him pause. Vince rose slowly, his boots quiet against the wooden floor as he made his way to Abigail's room. The door was slightly ajar, just as he'd left it. Abigail lay curled up under the pile of blankets, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Her breathing seemed easier than the night before, less labored, though still not entirely normal. The medication from the hospital was helping, but she had a long way to go. Her small face was still too pale, her cheeks flushed with the remnants of fever. She stirred again, her eyelids fluttering. Vince froze, not wanting to startle her. But she didn't wake, just shifted slightly and settled back into sleep. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, remembering how shallow and irregular it had been when he'd found her in the snow. The room felt cold. Vince quietly retrieved another blanket from the closet and carefully draped it over her. His movements were awkward, uncertain. Everything about this situation made him feel like his hands were too big, too rough for such delicate work. Back in the living room, the fire had caught properly. Warmth slowly began to spread through the cabin as Vince settled into his old leather armchair. The flames danced behind the stove's glass door, casting shifting shadows on the wall. His eyes were drawn to his hands, resting on the chair's worn arms. The knuckles were scarred, the skin marked with the stories of his past. Bar fights, motorcycle accidents, and worse things he tried not to think about anymore. These weren't the hands of someone who should be taking care of a child. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical thing. He'd spent decades running from it, living life on his own terms, answering to no one. The patch on his old leather jacket, now hanging by the door, had been his only real commitment, and even that he'd walked away from in the end. Now there was Abigail, sick and alone, depending on him. The thought made his stomach twist. What did he know about taking care of a kid? He couldn't even remember the last time he'd had a proper conversation with a child. The closest thing to parenting he'd done was mentoring rookie riders in the club, and that had usually ended in someone getting arrested or worse. The fire popped loudly, making him jump. Vince leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared into the flames. His past stretched out behind him like a long, dark road, filled with mistakes and regrets. He'd never stuck around when things got tough, never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. Running had become as natural as breathing. But now, with that little girl sleeping down the hall, running wasn't an option. For the first time in his life, Vince felt truly trapped, not by external forces, but by something inside himself. Something that wouldn't let him walk away from Abigail, even though every instinct told him he wasn't cut out for this. The floorboards creaked under Vince's feet as he made his way to the living room. The sun hadn't risen yet, but a dim gray light filtered through the windows. He'd managed to doze off in his chair for a few hours, his neck now stiff from the awkward position. As he rounded the corner, he stopped short. Abigail sat cross-legged on the floor near the wood stove, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her earlier. The fire's glow played across her small face as she stared into the flames, lost in thought. She looked so tiny there, drowning in the oversized blanket, her dark hair messy from sleep. When she noticed him, her lips curved into a slight smile, tentative but genuine. Something shifted in Vince's chest, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the feeling. "You're up early, kid," he said, his gruff voice barely above a whisper. The room felt different with her in it, less empty somehow. Abigail nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes followed him as he moved to check the fire, adding another log carefully. The wood settled with a soft crack, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and Vince noticed her slight shiver. "Cold?" he asked, already moving to grab another blanket from the stack he'd pulled out last night. She nodded again, and he draped it over her shoulders with clumsy gentleness. His massive hands looked almost comical next to her small frame. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Vince found himself grateful she wasn't one of those chatty kids he sometimes encountered at the grocery store. He could handle quiet. "Guess we should get some breakfast in you," he said finally, running a hand through his beard. "Doctor said you need to keep your strength up." In the kitchen, Vince rummaged through his cabinets. He didn't keep much food around, living alone, but he found some oatmeal and figured that would do. As he worked at the stove, he could hear Abigail's soft footsteps behind him. She'd followed him into the kitchen, blankets and all, settling into one of the wooden chairs at his small table. The oatmeal bubbled gently as he stirred it, adding a splash of milk and some sugar he'd forgotten he had. The morning light was stronger now, filling the kitchen with a soft glow. He could feel Abigail watching him, and when he glanced over his shoulder, she was studying him with those serious eyes of hers. "Are you my daddy?" The wooden spoon clattered against the pot as Vince's hand jerked in surprise. The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. His throat felt tight suddenly, and he kept his eyes fixed on the oatmeal, stirring mechanically. He cleared his throat, still not looking at her. "I'm just a friend, kid. Just someone trying to help out." The words felt wrong as soon as they left his mouth, but he couldn't take them back. He busied himself with the oatmeal, pretending he couldn't feel those eyes still watching him, pretending the word "daddy" hadn't just punched him straight in the gut with a force he never saw coming. The automatic doors of Wilson's General Store slid open with a soft whoosh. Vince stood there for a moment, his massive frame taking up most of the entrance. Beside him, Abigail looked even tinier than usual, still wearing the oversized sweater he'd found for her at his cabin. Her small hand was wrapped in his, and he could feel its warmth against his calloused palm. "Right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Clothes first, I guess." The children's section felt like foreign territory. Racks of tiny clothes in bright colors stretched before him, and he had no idea where to start. A few other shoppers gave him sideways glances, a hulking tattooed man with a scraggly beard looking completely lost among the princess t-shirts and sparkly leggings. "What size are you?" he asked Abigail, who just shrugged her shoulders. Vince ran a hand through his beard, feeling more out of his depth by the second. An elderly woman stocking shelves nearby must have noticed his distress. "How old is she?" she asked kindly, though Vince noticed she kept her distance. "6, he replied gruffly. "Try the 6X section over there," she pointed, then hurried away. Vince grabbed a few pairs of jeans, some t-shirts, and a warm jacket. He held up each item against Abigail, who stood patiently as he tried to guess if they would fit. When he reached for a bright pink dress, she wrinkled her nose and shook her head. Instead, she pointed to a simple blue one with white polka dots. "Good choice," he said, adding it to their cart. The food section wasn't any easier. Vince was used to buying for himself, mostly frozen dinners and canned goods. But kids needed proper food, right? He stared at the fresh produce, completely overwhelmed. "What do you like to eat?" he asked Abigail. She thought for a moment. "Apples," she said softly. "And peanut butter sandwiches." Vince grabbed apples, bread, and peanut butter, adding them to their cart. He threw in some carrots and oranges, too, figuring kids needed vegetables and stuff. The cart filled up quickly as he tried to think of everything a child might need. Toothbrush, hairbrush, soap that didn't smell like motor oil. At the checkout counter, Vince fumbled with his wallet. The total was more than he'd spent in one go in a long time, and his thick fingers felt clumsy as he counted out the bills. He could feel people watching him, probably wondering what a man like him was doing buying little. Girls' clothes and fruit snacks. Abigail stood beside him, her eyes fixed on his face with complete trust. She didn't seem to notice or care about the stares they were getting. To her, he was just the man who had saved her, who was trying his best to take care of her. Looking down at her, Vince felt something shift inside him. His hands steadied as he finished counting out the money. "I'll figure this out," he whispered to himself, determination replacing his earlier uncertainty. He might not know what he was doing, but for her sake, he would learn. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Vince stood in his small kitchen, staring at the box of pancake mix like it held ancient secrets. He'd never made pancakes before, but Abigail had mentioned liking them. His large hands, more accustomed to working on motorcycles than kitchen utensils, carefully measured the ingredients. The first pancake came out looking more like a misshapen blob than the perfect circles he'd seen in diners. He flipped it too late, and one side was burnt black. Vince cursed under his breath, tossing it in the trash. The second attempt wasn't much better. "Can I watch?" Abigail's quiet voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, wearing one of her new polka-dot pajamas. "Sure, kid." Vince pulled up a chair for her. "Though I ain't exactly an expert here." Together, they worked on making breakfast. Abigail sat on her knees in the chair, pointing out when bubbles formed on the pancake's surface, the signal to flip them. By the fifth try, they actually looked decent. The days fell into a pattern. Vince learned that Abigail needed her inhaler twice a day, and he set alarms on his phone to remind him. He figured out that she slept better with a nightlight, so he rigged up a small lamp in her room. When her cough lingered, he propped her up with extra pillows, just like the doctor had shown him. During the afternoons, they'd sit in the living room. Vince would try to read to her from the few children's books he'd bought, his gruff voice stumbling over words like hippopotamus and extraordinary. Abigail would sometimes correct him, and he'd grunt in acknowledgement, secretly grateful for the help. One particularly cold evening, they sat on the worn leather couch. The fire crackled in the wood stove, casting warm shadows across the room. Vince held a book about a lost puppy finding its way home, reading slowly and carefully. Abigail had gradually moved closer throughout the story, until she was pressed against his side. Her small body felt warm against him, and she clutched her new stuffed bear, another awkward purchase he'd made at the store. Her breathing was steady now, nothing like the worrying wheeze from when he'd found her in the snow. "The puppy finally saw his house in the distance," Vince read, his voice low and gentle. "He ran as fast as his tired legs could carry him." Abigail snuggled closer, her head resting against his arm. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, but she fought to keep them open, wanting to hear the end of the story. Vince felt something in his chest tighten, not the uncomfortable squeeze of anxiety he was used to, but something warmer, unfamiliar. As he finished the last page, he noticed Abigail had fallen asleep. She looked peaceful, her face relaxed and trusting. Carefully, as if handling something incredibly fragile, Vince scooped her up in his arms. Her head naturally found its place against his shoulder, and she sighed contentedly in her sleep. He carried her to her room, no longer the spare room he'd hastily cleared out, but now filled with her clothes, toys, and the colorful blanket they'd picked together. Gently, he laid her down and pulled the covers up to her chin. The nightlight cast a soft glow across her face, and for a moment, Vince just stood there, watching her sleep. In the quiet of the room, Vince felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't known in years. It was strange and new, but somehow felt right. The afternoon sun streamed through the cabin windows as Vince sat cross-legged on the floor, watching Abigail carefully count spaces on the board game they'd bought yesterday. It was a simple game, with colorful squares and cards, but Abigail's face lit up every time she moved her piece forward. 1, 2, 3? She touched each square with her finger, her tongue poking out in concentration. 4! I get to pick a card! Vince couldn't help but smile as she reached for the deck with her small hands. He'd never been much for board games, but seeing her excitement made something warm bloom in his chest. His own piece, the blue one, because Abigail had insisted on having the red, sat several spaces behind hers. "Draw 2 cards," Abigail read slowly, beaming. "That means I get to go again." "Sure does, kid." Vince watched as she carefully selected her next card. The fire crackled in the wood stove, and the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. Not just from the heat, but from something else, something he couldn't quite name. A sharp knock at the door cut through their peaceful afternoon. Vince's shoulders tensed automatically, old habits dying hard. Abigail looked up, her eyes wide with sudden uncertainty. "Stay here," Vince said quietly, pushing himself up from the floor. His knees cracked. He wasn't used to sitting on the ground for so long. He moved to the door, his stockinged feet silent on the wooden floors. Through the window, he could see a woman standing on his porch. She wore a neat brown coat and carried a clipboard, looking official in a way that made his stomach clench. He opened the door, positioning himself to block the view inside. "Mr. Calhoun?" The woman's voice was professional but kind. "I'm Maggie Thompson from Child Protective Services." She held up an ID badge. "May I come in? I need to discuss Abigail's situation with you." Vince's throat felt dry. He glanced back at Abigail, who was watching them with worried eyes, her game pieces forgotten. "Yeah," he managed. "Come in." Maggie stepped inside, her eyes taking in the cabin, the board game on the floor, the children's books stacked neatly on the coffee table, Abigail's drawings taped to the refrigerator. Her expression softened slightly. "Hello, Abigail," she said warmly. "I like your drawing over there. Did you make that?" Abigail nodded silently, moving closer to Vince until she was partially hidden behind his leg. Her small hand clutched at his jeans. "Mr. Calhoun, I need to speak with you privately," Maggie said. "It's about Abigail's case." Vince nodded stiffly. "Kid, why don't you go read in your room for a bit?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Abigail looked up at him, her eyes full of trust that made his heart ache. She gathered her stuffed bear and walked to her room, glancing back once before closing the door. "Mr. Calhoun," Maggie began, her voice gentle but firm. "I want to be straight with you. The state is conducting a search for any of Abigail's extended family members. It's standard procedure in cases like this." The words hit Vince like a physical blow. He'd known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this couldn't last forever. But hearing it said out loud made his stomach twist painfully. "We appreciate everything you've done for her," Maggie continued. "But you should be prepared for the possibility that we might locate relatives who could claim custody." Vince stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, trying to keep his voice steady. "She's doing good here. She's getting better." "I can see that," Maggie said softly. "But I need you to understand the situation. I'll be back soon with any updates on our search." She paused, looking at him with sympathy. "Try to prepare yourself, Mr. Calhoun. And prepare her, too." The morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Vince helped Abigail with her breakfast. She'd gotten stronger over the past few days, her cheeks showing more color, her appetite returning. She carefully spooned cereal into her mouth, swinging her legs under the kitchen table. A car door slammed outside. Vince's head snapped up, and he moved to the window. Maggie's familiar figure emerged from her car. But she wasn't alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man with gray hair followed her, his face set in hard lines. "Stay here, kid," Vince said quietly, his stomach nodding. "Finish your breakfast." He opened the door before they could knock. Maggie's expression was apologetic, professional. "Mr. Calhoun," she said, "this is Paul Davidson. He's Abigail's maternal grandfather." Paul stepped forward, his weathered face examining Vince with barely concealed disdain. He wore work boots and a heavy jacket, his demeanor as rough as Vince's own. But there was something else there, a sort of entitled anger that set Vince's teeth on edge. "Where's my granddaughter?" Paul demanded, trying to look past Vince into the cabin. "She's eating breakfast," Vince said, his voice low and controlled. "Maybe we should talk out here first." "Mr. Davidson has come forward to claim custody of Abigail," Maggie explained, her voice gentle but firm. "As her biological grandfather, he has certain rights we need to discuss." "Rights?" Paul's voice rose. "She's my blood. My daughter's child. What rights does this stranger have?" Vince's hands clenched at his sides. "I found her. I've been taking care of her." "Playing house, you mean?" Paul sneered. "Look at you. What do you know about raising a child? You think a few weeks of feeding her makes you family?" "Mr. Davidson," Maggie interjected, "please, this isn't helping." Inside the cabin, a small voice called out, "Vince?" Abigail appeared in the doorway, her spoon still in her hand. Her eyes widened at the sight of the strangers. Paul's expression changed instantly. "Abigail," he said, his voice softer but still carrying an edge. "I'm your grandpa, your mama's daddy." Abigail stepped back, moving closer to Vince's leg. Her small hand found his jeans, clutching the familiar fabric. The gesture wasn't lost on Paul, whose face darkened. "See what you've done?" he accused Vince. "Made her afraid of her own family. This isn't right. She belongs with real family, not some—" He gestured at Vince's tattoos, his rough appearance. "Not some biker playing pretend." The words hit Vince like physical blows. Every doubt he'd had about his ability to care for Abigail came rushing back. He looked down at her small face, saw the trust in her eyes, and felt his heart twist. "Mr. Davidson," Maggie said firmly, "this isn't the time or place. We need to handle this properly, through the proper channels." But Paul wasn't finished. "I won't have my granddaughter living in some cabin in the woods with a stranger. She needs stability, proper schooling, a real home." Vince stood there, silent, feeling Abigail's grip tighten on his leg. Everything he'd built with her over these weeks, the trust, the routine, the quiet moments of connection, suddenly felt fragile, temporary. Paul's words echoed in his head. Real family, proper home, stability. All the things he wasn't sure he could provide. "We'll need to set up a formal meeting," Maggie was saying, but her voice seemed distant. "Discuss the situation properly, with all parties involved." Vince looked down at Abigail again, saw the fear in her eyes, and felt his resolve wavering. Maybe Paul was right. Maybe he was fooling himself, thinking he could be what she needed. Vince stared at the official-looking envelope on his kitchen table, his coffee growing cold beside it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden surface, making the court summons seem even more ominous. Abigail was still asleep in her room, peaceful and unaware of the storm brewing around her future. His large hands trembled slightly as he picked up the paper again. The legal language was confusing, full of words he barely understood, but the message was clear enough. He had to appear in court to determine Abigail's custody. In 2 weeks, a judge would decide if he was fit to be her guardian. "Vince?" Abigail's sleepy voice came from the hallway. She rubbed her eyes, clutching her worn teddy bear. "What's that paper?" Vince quickly folded the summons and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Nothing important, kiddo. How about some breakfast?" But his mind was racing as he made her toast and scrambled eggs. What could he offer as evidence that he should keep her? He lived in a remote cabin, had a criminal record, and no steady job besides the occasional mechanical work he did for neighbors. Paul's words echoed in his head. Proper schooling, a real home. Later that afternoon, while Abigail napped, Vince made a call to a lawyer recommended by Maggie. The conversation was brief and direct. "Mr. Calhoun," the lawyer, James Miller, said, "I'll be honest, this won't be easy. But if you're serious about fighting for custody, I'll help you build your case." They arranged to meet that evening. Mrs. Peterson, a kind elderly neighbor who sometimes helped with Abigail, agreed to watch her while Vince went to town. The lawyer's office was small and cluttered, nothing like the fancy legal offices Vince had seen on TV. James Miller was younger than Vince expected, with tired eyes and a coffee-stained tie. "Let's go through what we have," Miller said, spreading papers across his desk. "How long has Abigail been with you?" 3 weeks, Vince admitted, the number sounding impossibly small. Miller nodded, making notes. "And during this time, you've provided for all her needs? Food, clothing, medical care?" "Everything I could think of," Vince said. "Got her clothes, toys, books, then giving her the medicine the doctor prescribed, making sure she eats good food, gets enough rest." "What about education plans?" Vince shifted uncomfortably. "Haven't gotten that far yet. Been focused on getting her healthy first." They spent the next 2 hours going over every detail of Vince's life with Abigail. Each question seems to highlight another area where he fell short of what a proper guardian should be. "Mr. Calhoun," Miller said finally, leaning back in his chair, "I won't sugarcoat this. On paper, Mr. Davidson has significant advantages. He's family, he has a stable address in the city, and presumably a regular income." Vince's heart sank, but Miller wasn't finished. "However, what you have is demonstrable care and commitment. You found her when no one else was looking. You've been there for her consistently since then. That counts for something." "But is it enough?" Vince asked, his voice rough with emotion. Miller shuffled through his notes. "We'll focus on your current situation, not your past. We'll emphasize the bond you've formed with Abigail, the stable environment you've created, and your dedication to her well-being. It won't be easy, but it's not impossible." The courtroom felt smaller than Vince had imagined. The wooden benches creaked under his weight as he shifted nervously, his clean flannel shirt feeling too tight around his neck. He'd trimmed his beard and pulled back his long hair, trying to look presentable, but he still felt out of place among the polished wood and stern faces. Paul sat across the aisle, wearing a crisp suit that probably cost more than Vince's entire wardrobe. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his expression was one of quiet confidence. Next to him, his lawyer shuffled through a stack of papers, occasionally whispering in Paul's ear. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Martha Wilson entered the courtroom. She was an older woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Paul's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my client is Abigail's biological grandfather. He can provide her with everything she needs: a proper home in the city, excellent schools, and, most importantly, a connection to her family heritage. Mr. Davidson has a stable income and a support system in place." Vince's hands clenched into fists under the table as Paul's lawyer continued. "While we appreciate Mr. Calhoun's temporary care of the child, Abigail belongs with her family. Her mother would have wanted her to know her roots, her history." James Miller, Vince's lawyer, stood next. His tie was slightly crooked, but his voice was steady. "Your Honor, we're not here to discuss hypotheticals about what might be best for Abigail. We're here to discuss what is actually best for her right now. Mr. Calhoun found Abigail when she was abandoned and seriously ill. He has provided her with consistent care, emotional support, and a stable environment." Miller pulled out several documents. "We have statements from Mrs. Peterson, a neighbor who helps with childcare, and Dr. Roberts, who has been treating Abigail's asthma. Both attest to Mr. Calhoun's dedication to Abigail's well-being." The judge listened carefully, her expression neutral. "Mr. Davidson," she addressed Paul directly, "could you explain why you didn't come forward sooner?" Paul stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of my daughter's passing immediately. When I found out, I began searching for Abigail right away." "And yet," the judge continued, "Mr. Calhoun was the one who found her, nearly frozen to death on a bench. Where were you then? Paul's face reddened slightly. I was looking through proper channels, Your Honor. Judge Wilson turned to Vince. Mr. Calhoun, what provisions have you made for Abigail's future? Vince stood slowly, his voice rough but sincere. Your Honor, I've been taking care of her day by day, making sure she's healthy, happy, and safe. I've enrolled her in the local school starting next month. I may not have much, but everything I have is for her now. The judge studied both men carefully before speaking. This is a complex situation that requires careful consideration. For now, I'm issuing a temporary ruling. Mr. Calhoun will retain custody of Abigail, with regular visits from social services to monitor the situation. We'll reconvene in 3 months for a final determination. Vince's relief was short-lived as he processed the words temporary and final determination. He glanced over at Abigail, who sat quietly with Mrs. Peterson in the back of the courtroom. When their eyes met, she gave him a small, trusting smile that made his heart ache. The responsibility of that trust weighed heavily on his shoulders as Paul's angry glare burned into his back. The old truck rumbled down the dirt road leading to Vince's cabin, its familiar drone doing nothing to calm his racing thoughts. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel as the weight of the day pressed down on him. In the passenger seat, Abigail hummed softly to herself, her small legs swinging back and forth, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing inside him. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees as they pulled up to the cabin. Mrs. Peterson had offered to take Abigail for the night, but Vince couldn't bear the thought of being apart from her right now, not when everything felt so uncertain. Home sweet home, he mumbled, helping Abigail out of the truck. She grabbed his large hand with her tiny one, squeezing it gently. The simple gesture made his throat tight. Inside, the cabin felt different somehow. The worn furniture and basic amenities that had always been enough for him now seemed inadequate. Paul's words echoed in his head about proper schools, better opportunities, a real family. Maybe the grandfather was right. Maybe Abigail deserved more than what an ex-biker could provide. Can we have mac and cheese? Abigail's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her best dress from court, her hair slightly messy from the long day. Sure thing, kiddo. Vince forced a smile, grabbing a pot from the cabinet. His hands trembled slightly as he filled it with water. Everything felt fragile, like it could slip away at any moment. While the pasta cooked, Abigail sat at the small kitchen table, coloring in one of her books. The scratch of crayons against paper filled the silence. Vince watched her, memorizing every detail. The way she stuck her tongue out when concentrating, how she hummed quietly to herself, the careful way she chose each crayon. Daddy, she said suddenly, looking up at him. Are you sad? The word daddy hit him hard, just like it did every time she used it. He turned back to the stove, stirring the pasta more vigorously than necessary. Just tired, sweetheart. After dinner, he helped her get ready for bed, going through their usual routine, teeth brushing, pajamas, and a story. Tonight, she picked The Velveteen Rabbit, one of her favorites. Vince's voice was rough as he read about the toy rabbit becoming real through love. Once Abigail was asleep, Vince sat in the old rocking chair beside her bed. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over her peaceful face. His chest ached as he watched her breathe, remembering how close he'd come to losing her that snowy night when he first found her. The temporary ruling felt like a ticking clock. 3 months. 3 months to prove he could be what Abigail needed. The thought of her being taken away, of her calling someone else daddy, made him feel physically ill. I'm not much, he whispered in the darkness, his voice barely audible. I ain't got fancy things or a big house. But I love you, kid. More more than I ever thought I could love anything." His eyes burned as he watched her sleep, remembering her trust in him, her small hand in his, her smile that made everything else fade away. Vince leaned forward in the chair, his massive frame seeming to shrink under the weight of his worry. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, something else was growing. Determination. He might not have much to offer, but he had love, and he had fight. And for Abigail, he'd use every bit of both. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official courthouse seal glaring up at Vince from the kitchen table. His coffee grew cold beside it as he stared at the words, reading them over and over until they blurred together. The final hearing was scheduled for next week. 7 days. That's all he had left before everything could change. Abigail sat in the living room, carefully arranging her stuffed animals for their morning tea party. The sound of her quiet chatter with her toys drifted through the cabin, making Vince's heart clench. He'd gotten used to these little moments, her imagination turning their simple cabin into magical worlds of adventure and joy. "Mr. Bear wants more sugar," she called out, completely unaware of the letter that threatened to tear their world apart. "Coming, sweetheart," Vince answered, his voice rougher than usual. He pushed himself up from the kitchen chair, his legs feeling heavy as lead. Walking to the living room, he watched as Abigail carefully poured imaginary tea into tiny plastic cups. She looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes. "Daddy, you can be the dragon protecting our castle." The word protecting hit him like a punch to the gut. What kind of protector was he if he couldn't even guarantee she'd still be here next week? His hands, covered in faded tattoos and old scars, trembled slightly as he lowered himself to the floor beside her. Later that afternoon, while Abigail napped, Vince drove into town. The courthouse loomed before him, its stone steps and imposing columns a stark reminder of his powerlessness. He parked his truck, but couldn't bring himself to get out right away. Through the windshield, he watched people coming and going. Lawyers in suits, families holding hands, court officials carrying stacks of papers. Each person represented a life being changed within those walls. Decisions being made that would alter futures forever. Finally, Vince stepped out of his truck. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. He remembered the first time he'd brought Abigail home, how scared he'd been of messing everything up. Now, months later, he was terrified of losing everything he never knew he wanted. Standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, Vince thought about their morning routines, how he'd learned to make her favorite breakfast, the way she insisted on wearing her rain boots even on sunny days, their nightly ritual of reading stories until she fell asleep. He thought about her nightmares and how she'd reach for him in the dark, trusting him to keep the monsters away. The memory of finding her on that snowy bench felt like a lifetime ago. She'd been so small, so cold, so alone. Just like he had been, though in a different way. Together, they'd found something neither of them had before. A real family. His chest tightened as he stared up at the courthouse windows. Each breath felt shallow, insufficient. The thought of walking into that building next week, of possibly walking out without the right to call himself Abigail's father anymore, made him feel like he was drowning on dry land. A young family passed by, a little girl about Abigail's age skipping between her parents. The sight made Vince's vision blur. He turned away, his massive frame seeming to shrink under the weight of his fears. 7 days. 7 more days to prove he deserved to be Abigail's father, even though he couldn't shake the feeling it wouldn't be enough. The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray. Vince adjusted his borrowed tie for the 100th time, the stiff collar of his only dress shirt feeling like it might choke him. In the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, looking more like a banker than a former biker. Abigail sat at the kitchen table, wearing her best blue dress, her small feet swinging back and forth beneath her chair. She'd been unusually quiet all morning, as if she could sense the weight of what was about to happen. "You look pretty, Daddy," she said softly, watching him struggle with the tie. His hands froze at her words. Even after all these months, hearing her call him Daddy still hit him right in the heart. He turned to her, managing a small smile. "Thanks, sweetheart. Ready to go?" The courthouse was already bustling when they arrived. Their lawyer, Sarah Matthews, met them at the entrance, her briefcase clutched tightly in her hands. "Remember what we discussed, Mr. Calhoun," she said quietly. "Just speak from your heart." Inside the courtroom, Paul sat with his lawyer, looking polished and proper in his expensive suit. He gave Vince a cold stare as they walked past. Abigail gripped Vince's hand tighter. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Henderson entered the courtroom. The sound of shuffling feet filled the air. Everyone stood. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver hair, looked over her glasses at the assembled group. "We're here today to determine the custody of Abigail Marie Thompson," she announced. "I'll hear from both parties before making my final decision." Paul's lawyer went first, painting a picture of family heritage and blood ties. He spoke about Paul's successful business, his stable home, his ability to provide Abigail with everything she could need. The words felt hollow to Vince, like they were talking about buying a car rather than raising a child. When it was Vince's turn, he stood slowly. His hands were shaking, but his voice came out clear and strong. "Your Honor," he began, "I know I'm not what most people would consider ideal father material. I've made mistakes in my life. Big ones." He paused, glancing at Abigail, who watched him with complete trust in her eyes. But finding Abigail that night in the snow, it changed everything. She taught me what it means to be responsible for someone else, to put their needs before your own. His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I learned how to make her favorite breakfast. I learned to check under her bed for monsters and to hold her when she has nightmares. I learned that being a father isn't about blood or money or what you can buy. It's about being there, every day, through the good and the bad." Vince stood straighter, his full height impressive in the courtroom. "Abigail is my daughter now. Not by blood, but by choice. By love. And I'm asking you today to let me keep being her father, because that's who I am now. That's who she made me." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Henderson considered both arguments. Minutes stretched like hours as she reviewed the papers before her. Finally, she looked up. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I find it in the best interest of the child to grant full custody to Vincent Calhoun." The words hit Vince like a wave of warmth. He barely heard the rest of the judge's statement as Abigail broke free from the court assistant and ran toward him, her arms spread wide, her face beaming with joy. The courthouse steps never felt more welcoming as Vince and Abigail descended them together, their hands clasped tightly. The afternoon sun had broken through the gray clouds, casting a warm glow over everything. Vince's borrowed tie hung loose around his neck now, but he didn't care. His heart felt lighter than it had in years. "Ice cream?" Abigail looked up at him with hopeful eyes, swinging their joined hands back and forth. "To celebrate?" Vince chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that came straight from his chest. "Sure thing, sweetheart. Whatever you want." They walked to the small ice cream parlor 2 blocks away, Abigail skipping every few steps. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and the teenage girl behind the counter smiled at them. Vince noticed she didn't flinch at his tattoos or his size like people usually did. Maybe it was because of the little girl holding his hand, or maybe it was the smile he couldn't seem to wipe off his face. "Chocolate with rainbow sprinkles, please," Abigail said, standing on her tiptoes to see over the counter. "Make that 2, Vince added, pulling out his wallet. They sat at a small table by the window, watching people pass by on the street outside. Abigail's feet dangled from her chair as she happily devoured her ice cream. Some of it had smeared around her mouth, and Vince grabbed a napkin to wipe it away, the gesture now natural and familiar. "Daddy?" Abigail said, her voice suddenly serious. "We're really family now, right? Forever?" Vince's throat tightened. "Yeah, kiddo. Forever. No one's gonna change that." She nodded, satisfied with his answer, and went back to her ice cream. Vince watched her, still amazed at how this little girl had completely transformed his life. The man he'd been before finding her in the snow seemed like a stranger now. After finishing their treats, they headed home in Vince's old truck. Abigail hummed along to the radio, making up words when she didn't know the real ones. The familiar road to their cabin felt different somehow, like they were truly going home for the first time. The cabin welcomed them with its weathered wooden walls and slightly crooked chimney. Inside, Vince started preparing dinner while Abigail set the table, something that had become their routine over the past months. She carefully placed the plates and forks exactly where they should be, her tongue sticking out in concentration. "Almost ready," Vince called from the kitchen, stirring the pot of spaghetti sauce. He'd learned to cook a few decent meals since Abigail came into his life, and pasta had become their favorite. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of garlic and tomatoes. Vince served the food onto their plates, while Abigail poured them each a glass of milk. They sat down together at their small table, the same one where they'd shared their first meal months ago, when everything was uncertain and new. Now, looking across at his daughter, officially and forever, Vince felt complete. Abigail twirled spaghetti around her fork, getting more sauce on her face than in her mouth, and grinned at him. Vince smiled back, his heart full to bursting with love and gratitude for this unexpected gift of family he'd been given. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Vince flipped pancakes on the griddle. He'd gotten pretty good at making them perfectly round, just the way Abigail liked them. The smell of butter and maple syrup filled their small cabin kitchen. "Breakfast's ready," he called out, sliding 2 golden pancakes onto a plate decorated with cartoon characters. Abigail bounced into the kitchen, her backpack already on, her hair neatly braided, a skill Vince had mastered after countless YouTube tutorials. "Are there blueberries?" she asked, climbing onto her chair. "You bet." Vince sprinkled fresh berries over her pancakes and added a small dollop of whipped cream. It was their morning ritual now, this quiet breakfast together before school. The drive to Riverside Elementary had become one of Vince's favorite parts of the day. Abigail would chat about her friends, her teachers, and whatever book they were reading in class. His old truck, once a symbol of his solitary life, now carried lunchboxes, school projects, and the endless chatter of a 6-year-old. "Remember," he said as he pulled up to the school drop-off zone, "I'll pick you up at 3. "I know, Daddy." Abigail leaned over to give him a quick hug before hopping out. "Don't forget we have to work on my science project tonight." Vince watched her skip toward the school entrance, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. Other parents waved to him now, no longer intimidated by his tattooed arms or gruff appearance. Ms. Thompson, Abigail's teacher, even smiled warmly as she greeted students at the door. The afternoons were filled with homework at the kitchen table. Vince discovered he had a knack for math, helping Abigail work through her addition and subtraction problems. Science was trickier, but they tackled it together, learning about plants and animals through the simple experiments in her textbook. Their evenings always ended the same way. After dinner and dishes, they'd settle into the worn armchair by the fireplace. Vince would hold open a book while Abigail snuggled against his chest, her finger following along with the words as she practiced reading. "The little engine that could," she read carefully, "puffed up the mountain." Her reading was getting better every day, and pride swelled in Vince's chest with each correctly pronounced word. Sometimes, during these quiet moments, Vince would catch their reflection in the window. This huge, tattooed former biker cradling a tiny girl in pink pajamas, and marvel at how natural it felt now. The man who once thought he'd spend his life alone now couldn't imagine existing without these simple routines, without the sound of small feet padding across wooden floors, without bedtime stories and morning pancakes. That night, after their reading session, Vince carried a sleepy Abigail to her room. Her walls, once bare, were now covered with her artwork, crayon drawings of their cabin, of Vince's truck, of the two of them holding hands under a bright yellow sun. He tucked her into bed, pulling her favorite purple blanket up to her chin. As he leaned down to kiss her forehead, Abigail wrapped her small arms around his neck. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice soft and sincere. Vince's chest tightened, and his vision blurred with unexpected tears. He hugged her close, breathing in the sweet smell of her strawberry shampoo. This love, so pure and unconditional, was something he never thought he'd experience. It filled every empty space in his heart, healing wounds he didn't even know he had. Colored. Lights twinkled on the small pine tree in the corner of Vince's cabin. The scent of fresh evergreen mixed with the aroma of cookies baking in the oven. Abigail stood on a wooden chair, her tongue poking out in concentration as she carefully placed a red glass ball on a branch. "Is this one good, Daddy?" she asked, adjusting the ornament until it hung just right. Vince looked up from untangling a string of lights. "Perfect, sweetheart, just like all the others." They had spent the afternoon decorating, transforming the once sparse cabin into a Christmas wonderland. Paper snowflakes that Abigail had made at school dotted the windows, and tinsel garland wrapped around the fireplace mantel. A small collection of presents wrapped in bright paper with slightly crooked bows waited beneath the tree. "Can you lift me up?" Abigail asked, holding the star for the top of the tree. "I want to put it on myself this year." Vince set down the lights and walked over to her. His large hands wrapped around her tiny waist as he lifted her high. She stretched her arms, tongue still poked out in concentration, and carefully placed the star on top. "There," she declared triumphantly. "Now it's perfect." Vince lowered her down but didn't let go right away, hugging her close instead. The timer on the oven beeped, and Abigail squirmed out of his arms. "The cookies!" she exclaimed, running to the kitchen. Vince followed, making sure she put on oven mitts before helping her remove the tray of sugar cookies they'd shaped together earlier. The sweet smell filled the cabin as they cooled on the counter. Outside, snow began to fall in thick, lazy flakes. Abigail pressed her nose against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "It's so pretty," she whispered. They settled on the worn couch near the fireplace, where flames crackled and danced. Abigail curled up next to Vince, her head resting against his arm. The Christmas lights cast soft colors across her face as she watched the snow through the window. "This is the best Christmas ever," she said softly. Vince looked down at her, this tiny person who had completely transformed his life. A year ago, he'd spent Christmas alone in this same cabin, with no decorations, no cookies, no laughter. Now, watching the pure joy on Abigail's face as she gazed at their decorated tree, he felt a tear slip down his cheek. He remembered all those years of running with the gang, thinking that was the only family he'd ever have. How wrong he'd been. This quiet moment with his daughter, watching snow fall on Christmas Eve. This was what family really meant. Abigail noticed his tear and reached up to wipe it away with her small finger. "Are you sad, Daddy?" "No, baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm just happy. So very happy." She smiled and snuggled closer, pulling the blanket up around them both as they watched the snow continue to fall outside. The fire crackled, the lights twinkled, and in that moment, Vince knew he had everything he'd ever needed right here in this small cabin. The phone's ring cut through the peaceful morning silence. Vince looked up from where he sat at the kitchen table, helping Abigail with her math homework. The caller ID showed a name he hadn't seen in months. Johnny. "Keep working on those problems, sweetheart," Vince said, ruffling Abigail's hair as he stood. "I'll be right back." He stepped onto the front porch, pulling his jacket close against the winter chill. His breath came out in white puffs as he answered the call. "Big V!" Johnny's familiar gravelly voice boomed through the speaker. "Man, it's been too long. How you holding up in that hermit cabin of yours?" Vince leaned against the porch railing, watching as a pair of cardinals flitted between the snow-covered trees. "I'm good, Johnny. Real good, actually." "Something's different," Johnny said after a pause. "Your voice, you sound happy?" A smile spread across Vince's face as he heard Abigail humming to herself through the window. "Yeah, well, things have changed quite a bit since we last talked." "Changed how? Last time I checked, you were determined to live out your days alone in that cabin, brooding about the past." Vince chuckled, a warm sound that would have surprised his old friends. "Life had other plans. I've got a daughter now, Johnny. Her name's Abigail." The line went quiet for a moment. "A daughter? You? The same Vince who swore he'd never settle down?" "Sometimes the best things in life catch you by surprise," Vince said, his voice soft. Through the window, he could see Abigail concentrating on her homework, her pencil tapping against her chin just like she did every time she was thinking hard about something. "Tell me about her," Johnny said, genuine curiosity in his voice. "She's amazing, Johnny. Smart as a whip, kind-hearted, brave." Vince's chest swelled with pride. "Found her in a snowstorm last winter, nearly frozen. Now I can't imagine life without her." "Never thought I'd hear Big V talking like a proud papa," Johnny teased, but there was warmth in his voice. "Sounds like she's been good for you." "She saved me, Johnny. All those years running with the gang, thinking we were family." Vince shook his head. "This is what real family feels like. This is what I was meant for." "You always did have a soft heart under all that leather and attitude," Johnny said. "Remember how you used to sneak food to that stray cat behind the clubhouse?" Vince laughed, remembering. "Yeah, well, don't go spreading that around. Got a reputation to maintain." Through the window, Abigail looked up and waved at him, holding up her completed homework with a proud grin. Vince waved back, his heart full. Listen, Johnny, I should get going. Abigail's waiting on me to check her math homework. Math homework? Johnny whistled. Man, you really have gone domestic. Wouldn't have it any other way, Vince said, and he meant it. Take care of yourself, Big V. And that little girl of yours. Will do, Johnny. Stay safe out there. Vince ended the call and stood for a moment on the porch, looking at the peaceful winter scene before him. The old him would have been restless, itching for the road, for the next adventure. But now, all he wanted was to go back inside, sit next to his daughter, and help her understand fractions. He slipped the phone into his pocket, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the peaceful afternoon silence. Vince looked up from where he sat with Abigail, reading her favorite storybook. Through the window, he saw a familiar truck pulling up to the cabin. His muscles tensed as he recognized Paul's weathered face behind the steering wheel. Stay here, sweetheart, Vince said softly, marking their place in the book. Abigail nodded, clutching her stuffed bear closer. Vince stepped onto the porch just as Paul climbed out of his truck. The older man looked different somehow, less rigid, more uncertain. His shoulders slumped slightly as he approached the steps. Wasn't expecting to see you, Vince said, keeping his voice neutral despite the protective instinct rising in his chest. Paul stopped at the bottom of the steps, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. I know. I probably should have called first. Through the window, Abigail watched them, her small face pressed against the glass. Paul's eyes drifted to her, and something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or longing. The expression was gone as quickly as it appeared. She looks just like her mother, Paul said quietly. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Vince shifted his weight, uncertain. You want to come in? It's cold out here. Paul nodded, following Vince into the cabin. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the tension between the two men. Abigail stayed in her chair, watching them with wide eyes. Hi, Grandpa Paul, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul's tough exterior cracked a little more. Hi, Abigail. He looked around the cabin, taking in the children's drawings on the fridge, the neatly organized school books on the table, the collection of stuffed animals on Abigail's bed in the corner. You've done good here, Paul said finally, turning to Vince. Better than I could have. Vince remained silent, waiting. He could sense there was more coming. Paul ran a hand through his gray hair, looking older than Vince had ever seen him. I came here today because I needed to see for myself. And to tell you something. He moved to sit in one of the kitchen chairs, his movements heavy with what seemed like the weight of years. I wasn't there for my daughter, Abigail's mother. I was always too busy, too caught up in my own life. By the time I realized what I'd lost, it was too late. Abigail watched her grandfather with solemn eyes, still clutching her bear. I thought... Paul's voice wavered. I thought taking Abigail would give me a second chance, make up for what I didn't do for her mother. But watching you with her... He gestured around the cabin. You're giving her everything I couldn't. Everything I'm still not ready to give. Vince felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Paul... No, let me finish, Paul interrupted. I'm not here to fight anymore. I'm here to tell you that I was wrong. You might not be blood, but you're more of a father to her than I could ever be. He stood up slowly, looking at Abigail with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. I'm sorry, little one. Your daddy's right here, and he's doing a fine job." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Paul moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Take care of her, Vince. She deserves the best." The morning sun painted the town's main street in warm, golden light as Vince walked hand in hand with Abigail. Her small fingers wrapped tightly around his calloused hand, and she skipped alongside him with boundless energy. The sight of them together still turned heads, the towering, tattooed ex-biker and the tiny girl with bouncing pigtails, but Vince no longer noticed the stares. "Can we get ice cream, Daddy?" Abigail asked, pointing to the small parlor on the corner. Her eyes sparkled with hope, and Vince felt his heart melt a little more. "Sure thing, Princess," he said, his gruff voice softened by affection. "But after lunch, okay?" They made their way to the local diner first, where Mary, the waitress, greeted them with a warm smile. She'd gotten used to their weekly visits and already knew their order by heart. "The usual?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Grilled cheese for the little lady and a burger for Dad?" Vince nodded, watching as Abigail carefully colored the children's menu with crayons. 6 months ago, he would have laughed if someone had told him he'd be having regular lunch dates with a 6-year-old. Now, it felt as natural as breathing. While they waited for their food, Vince observed the changes in Abigail. Her cheeks were fuller now, pink with health, and her eyes sparkled with life. Gone was the frightened, frozen child he'd found on that bench. In her place was a happy, chattering little girl who trusted him completely. "Look, Daddy!" Abigail held up her drawing, a somewhat lopsided house with 2 stick figures standing in front. "That's our cabin, and that's us." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Vince said, carefully taking the drawing. He'd need to make space on the fridge among the growing collection of artwork. After lunch, they kept their ice cream promise. Abigail chose strawberry with extra sprinkles, while Vince stuck to plain vanilla. They sat on a bench in the town square, watching pigeons waddle past and people going about their day. "Remember when you first came to live with me?" Vince asked softly, wiping ice cream from Abigail's chin with a napkin. "I was scared I wouldn't know how to take care of you." Abigail looked up at him with those wise eyes that sometimes seemed too old for her young face. "But you did take care of me," she said simply. "You're the best daddy ever." A lump formed in Vince's throat. He remembered those first, uncertain days, the sleepless nights wondering if he was doing the right thing, the fear that he wasn't good enough. Now, watching Abigail happily swing her legs as she finished her ice cream, he realized how far they'd come. They spent the afternoon window shopping, stopping to admire toys and books. Vince bought her a new coloring book, and they visited the library to return last week's books and check out new ones. Simple pleasures that had become the foundation of their life together. As they drove back to the cabin, Abigail dozed in her car seat, clutching her new coloring book. Vince glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his heart full. The road ahead was familiar now, leading them home. Their home. Pulling up to the cabin, Vince felt the last traces of doubt and worry slip away. This was right. This was where they belonged. Abigail wasn't just a child he'd saved anymore. She was his daughter, and nothing would ever change that. Vince sat at the kitchen table, staring at the job offer letter in his hands. The construction company in Seattle wanted him as their head mechanic. Good pay, benefits, everything he'd dreamed of before Abigail came into his life. His old friend Johnny had put in a good word for him, knowing Vince's skill with machinery. Through the window, he watched Abigail playing in the yard. She was building a snowman, her pink winter coat bright against the white snow. The cabin had become their sanctuary, a place where both of their wounded hearts had begun to heal. The letter crinkled in his grip. Moving to the city would mean better schools for Abigail, more opportunities and financial security, but it would also mean leaving behind the peace they'd found here. The thought of uprooting her again, after everything she'd been through, made his stomach twist. Abigail came bursting through the door, her cheeks red from the cold.
"Daddy, come see my snowman. He needs a nose."
"In a minute, sweetheart," Vince said, trying to hide the worry in his voice. "Can you sit with me for a second? We need to talk about something." Abigail's smile faded slightly as she climbed into the chair next to him. She could always sense when something was bothering him.
"Is everything okay?"
Vince ran a hand through his beard, searching for the right words. "I got offered a job in the city, a really good job. But it would mean we'd have to move away from the cabin." Abigail's eyes widened and she gripped the edge of the table.
"Leave our home?"
"We'd get a nice apartment," Vince continued, his heart aching at her expression. "There'd be better schools and lots of other kids your age to play with, maybe even a park nearby."
"But what about my room?"
Abigail's voice trembled.
"And my garden? And the tree where we hang the bird feeder?"
Vince reached out and took her small hand in his. "I know it's a big change, but sometimes changes can be good. What do you think?" Abigail was quiet for a long moment, her face scrunched in thought. Then she looked up at him with those eyes that could see straight through to his soul.
"Are you happy here, Daddy?"
The question caught him off guard. "Of course I am, Princess."
"Then why do we need to go?"
She squeezed his hand.
"I don't want a different home. I want our home."
Vince looked around the cabin, at the crayon drawings covering the fridge, the pile of books by the fireplace, the measuring marks on the doorframe showing Abigail's growth. Every corner held a memory of their life together. "You know what?" he said, pulling her onto his lap. "You're right. We don't need to go anywhere."
"Really?"
Hope brightened her face. "Really." Vince reached for the letter and folded it carefully. "We've got everything we need right here." Abigail threw her arms around his neck, and Vince held her close. The job offer might have looked good on paper, but nothing could compare to the life they'd built here. Their happiness wasn't measured in dollars or opportunities. It was in the quiet moments, the shared laughter, the peace they'd found together. "Now," he said, setting her down, "what was that about a snowman needing a nose?" The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Vince and Abigail stepped out into the crisp evening air, their boots crunching in the fresh powder. Steam rose from their breath as they walked hand in hand, moving away from the warmth of their cabin. Behind them, golden light spilled from the windows, making the little house glow like a beacon in the gathering dusk. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of pine and wood fire into the cold air. The Christmas lights they'd strung along the porch rails twinkled softly, reflecting off the snow. Vince felt Abigail's small hand squeeze his larger one. Her pink mittens were a stark contrast against his weathered work gloves. She walked with a bounce in her step, kicking up little puffs of snow as they made their way toward their favorite spot near the edge of the clearing.
"Look, Daddy!"
Abigail pointed to their snowman, still standing proud despite the fresh snowfall. His carrot nose stuck out at an odd angle, and the scarf around his neck fluttered in the gentle breeze.
"He's still smiling,"
Vince chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "Just like someone else I know," he said, reaching down to adjust her wool hat. The movement revealed the tattoos on his wrist, peeking out from under his jacket sleeve, remnants of his old life that seemed to matter less and less each day. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft pinks and purples. The forest around them was peaceful, the bare branches of the trees dusted with white. This was their sanctuary, their piece of the world where the past couldn't touch them. Vince thought about how far they'd come. Just months ago, he'd been a lonely man, hardened by life and his own mistakes. Then he'd found a little girl in the snow, and everything had changed. The custody battles, the doubts, the fears, they'd weathered it all together. The cabin behind them wasn't much. The porch still creaked, and the window in Abigail's room still stuck sometimes when it rained. But it was home. Their home. The place where bedtime stories were read, where morning pancakes filled the air with sweetness, where two broken hearts had found healing in each other. Abigail tugged at his sleeve, her face tilted up toward him. Snowflakes caught in her eyelashes as she blinked. The trust in her eyes made his chest tight with emotion. Gone was the scared, sick little girl he'd found that winter night. In her place stood his daughter, strong and loved. "I'm glad you found me, Daddy," she said softly, her words carrying clearly in the still evening air. Vince felt tears well up in his eyes, and for once he didn't try to hide them. He knelt down in the snow and pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close. His little girl, his miracle, his second chance at life. In that moment, with the snow falling gently around them and their cabin glowing warmly behind them, Vince knew with absolute certainty that their new life had just begun. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.